Under the heavy canopy of the Philippine jungle, July 27, 1944, the air was thick with the smell of rain, oil, and decay. American infantrymen crouched low, their boots sinking into the wet earth, as distant thunder blended with the sound of idling engines. Through the fog of humidity and gunpowder, the deep growl of tank tracks began to echo, a rhythm that would soon rewrite the balance of fear. Japanese soldiers, dug into camouflage positions, whispered to each other, laughing quietly. American tanks, one scoffed, tapping his Arisaka rifle. Paper armor. Burning coffins. They'd seen what had happened at Bataan 2 years earlier. Light tanks, thinly plated and easily pierced by a single anti-tank round. But today would not be Bataan. Today, something new was coming. U.S. Army Field Report, Luzon, July 1944. Then, from beyond the ridgeline, came a roar like thunder cracking the sky. Through sheets of monsoon rain emerged the unmistakable silhouettes of M4 Sherman tanks, bigger, heavier, and bristling with confidence. Their steel hulls glistened under the tropical downpour, white stars barely visible beneath layers of mud. The ground shook with every turn of their tracks. Trees splintered as they advanced, engines growling like beasts unleashed from the sea. For the first time in the Pacific, America's armored fist was coming through the jungle. U.S. Armored Forces Log, July 1944. In the confusion, Japanese anti-tank teams scrambled. Type 147mm guns were dragged into position, their barrels caked in mud. But when they fired, the shells ricocheted harmlessly off the Sherman's sloped armor. Sparks flashed like lightning in the gloom. The Americans didn't stop. One by one, the Japanese guns fell silent, overrun, destroyed, or abandoned. Inside their hulls, the Sherman crews fought like men who had learned from failure, from the humiliation of early defeats. Their radios crackled with clipped voices, target neutralized. Advance 10 yards. Keep formation tight. Every movement was precise, disciplined, and relentless. After action report, 37th Infantry Division, 1944. 2 years earlier, the idea of tanks in the Pacific had been laughed off by both sides. Dense jungles, narrow trails, swamps, and steep ridges made the concept seem absurd. Even American planners doubted armor could function here. But the tide of the war had changed. By 1944, U.S. forces were no longer content to fight island by island. They needed something more than infantry and naval bombardment. They needed mobility, shock, and firepower that could break through entrenched defenses. And that meant tanks. War Department Memorandum, Pacific Strategy Brief, 1943. The Sherman was not a perfect machine. Its 75mm gun wasn't the most powerful in the world. Its armor could still be breached by a well-placed shot. But it was reliable, mobile, and, most importantly, everywhere. Factories across Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago had turned into war forges, churning out over 49,000 Shermans by 1945. That meant spare parts, repair crews, and replacements could be shipped across oceans like clockwork. The Japanese army, stretched thin across vast island chains, could not hope to match such logistical might. U.S. War Production Board Report, 1945. As the rain eased, the Shermans pushed deeper into the jungle, their treads crushing bamboo and undergrowth beneath tons of steel. Infantry followed in their wake, using the tanks as cover against snipers and machine gun nests. The coordination between the two, armor and infantry, was still new in this theater. Radios, once unreliable in humid climates, now crackled clearly thanks to improved waterproofing by engineers at Motorola. Those engineers never saw the jungles their work would conquer, but their designs meant life or death for the men relying on them. Motorola Field Communications Memo, 1944. By mid-afternoon, the American column reached the outskirts of a Japanese stronghold near the Ogno River. Camouflaged bunkers waited in silence. Then came the eruption. Artillery from hidden ridges, mortars bursting in trees, and shrapnel raining down. One Sherman took a direct hit on its turret, the explosion painting the foliage in smoke and fire. Inside the tank, the crew fought panic. The gunner, drenched in sweat, swung the turret and fired back blindly into the trees. The shell detonated a munitions cache, and the jungle lit up like a furnace. The battle had become a storm of metal and flame. U.S. Army Combat Film Unit, Reel number 432, 1944. To the Japanese defenders, the Sherman was more than just a tank. It was an insult. They had built their strategy around the jungle's protection, believing no machine could maneuver here. But now, these American tanks were doing the impossible, climbing muddy inclines, crossing rivers, and smashing through bamboo barricades. The Japanese diaries recovered later spoke of disbelief. One line read simply, "They move like demons, even through the forest." Captured diary, Japanese 26th Division. 1944, the American tankers had been told that jungle combat would be a nightmare. Visibility was limited to a few yards. The heat was suffocating. Engines overheated. Snakes slithered into open hatches at night. Mechanics often worked waist-deep in mud to keep the machines running. But they adapted. Crews stripped weight, modified air filters, and improvised track repairs with machetes and wire. The jungles of Luzon became both a proving ground and a graveyard. And every tank that kept moving was a testament to the engineers who built them. Ordnance Maintenance Log, Luzon Sector, 1944. By sunset, the last resistance was silenced. Smoke rose from the wreckage, curling into the blood-red sky. American soldiers stood beside their tanks, exhausted, their uniforms soaked with sweat and grime. A lieutenant stared at the blackened remains of a Japanese anti-tank gun and muttered, "They called these coffins once." He ran a hand across the dented armor of his Sherman, its surface scarred but intact. Not anymore. Field interview, 145th Infantry Regiment. 1944. That day, deep in the Philippine jungle, a myth had died. The myth that the jungle belonged only to the infantry. That tanks were too heavy, too clumsy, and too weak. The Sherman had defied nature itself, turning mud and rain into allies. But as the smoke cleared, one question hung over the battlefield. What made these tanks unstoppable? Because beyond armor and firepower, there was something else, something hidden in the gears, the radios, and the minds behind the machines, something the Japanese never saw coming. Under the relentless tropical heat of August 1944, the sound of American engines became the jungle's new thunder. The Sherman tank, once derided as too soft for Asia, had proven it could not only survive in the Pacific but dominate it. Yet, the question lingered. Why? The answer lay not in brute force, but in something far more subtle, an invisible web of design, industry, and innovation that gave these tanks their edge long before they ever reached the battlefield. U.S. Ordnance Technical Division Report, 1944. It began in Detroit. In the cavernous halls of the Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, America's arsenal of democracy. By 1942, this facility could roll out one new M4 Sherman every 40 minutes. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler worked side by side, turning peacetime assembly lines into war engines. Engineers like Harold Christ and Ed Cole redesigned transmission systems to handle both swamps and deserts, ensuring tanks could shift through gears even while half submerged. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was the kind that saved lives thousands of miles away. Detroit Arsenal Manufacturing Log, 1943. The Sherman's secret wasn't the thickness of its armor or the size of its gun. It was reliability. Every nut, every cable, and every weld had to endure hellish conditions. 100% humidity, clogged filters, rotting rubber, and grit that chewed through engines like sandpaper. Japanese tanks, like the Type 95 Hago, weighed barely 7 tons and could not match that endurance. Their thin armor, often under 12 mm on the sides, made them helpless against the Sherman's 75 mm M3 gun, which could penetrate 68 mm of armor at 500 yards. The difference was catastrophic. Technical Manual TM9-731A, 1943, but the real transformation came from something few soldiers ever saw: the radios. Every Sherman carried an FM radio, a revolutionary leap for tank warfare. Unlike the unreliable AM sets used by most Axis armor, FM communication cut through static, jungle humidity, and even artillery interference. Motorola's design team, led by engineer Daniel Noble, perfected the SCR-508 set that allowed tank commanders to coordinate in real time. What the Japanese saw as supernatural coordination was, in truth, a triumph of engineering. Signal Corps Communications Field Report, 1944. Inside the turrets, the atmosphere was stifling, air thick with exhaust, oil, and sweat. The commander's eyes darted between periscopes, relaying commands through the headset. 2 o'clock, ridge line. Fire. The gunner's world shrank to a crosshair and a heartbeat. And yet, these crews fought as one unit. Armored infantry guided by voices in the static. The jungle no longer silenced them. It amplified their unity. Tank Crew Oral History, 37th Armored Battalion, 1944. The Japanese defenders couldn't comprehend it. Their tanks and anti-tank teams operated in isolation, often without radio contact. Messages were carried by runners or signal flags, a system centuries old. In contrast, the Americans could coordinate tanks, artillery, and infantry instantly. During the Battle of San Manuel in January 1945, this advantage reached its peak. The 716th Tank Battalion, working alongside the 25th Infantry Division, used Sherman radio networks to outmaneuver Japanese defenses buried beneath the volcanic soil. U.S. Army Combat Report, San Manuel, 1945. At dawn, the battle began. The village of San Manuel was a fortress of bunkers and concealed guns, defended by the Japanese 10th Tank Regiment. The Americans rolled forward cautiously, their Shermans advancing in wedge formation. Enemy artillery opened fire from concealed ridges, shaking the ground. One Sherman erupted into flames, its ammunition cooking off like fireworks. But even as it burned, other tanks shifted positions without hesitation. Orders were transmitted instantly. Left flank forward, suppress that ridge. Within minutes, coordinated volleys silenced the threat. After action report, 716th Tank Battalion, 1945. The Japanese Type 97 Chiha tanks counterattacked, their 57mm guns flashing through the smoke. The Shermans returned fire, their 75mm rounds slamming through thin armor like paper. By noon, dozens of Japanese tanks lay gutted and smoking. Even when Japanese infantry swarmed forward with satchel charges, coordination between tankers and infantry proved decisive. Sherman machine gunners, guided by spotter reports over radio, shredded the assaults before they reached effective range. Captured enemy report, Japanese 10th Tank Regiment, 1945, dramatized composite. The technical difference between the two sides was staggering. A Sherman's Continental R975 radial engine produced 400 horsepower, giving it a top speed of 24 miles per hour, almost double that of a Japanese Chiha. Its sloped 63mm front armor deflected hits that would have penetrated flat plates. The U.S. crews also benefited from gyrostabilizers, allowing them to fire with surprising accuracy even while moving, something unheard of in Japanese armor doctrine. U.S. Ordnance Department Spec Sheet, 1943. Behind every tank rolling into the jungle stood an invisible army: engineers, mechanics, and factory workers. In Hawaii and New Guinea, field workshops run by the Ordnance Corps created mobile repair depots. Tanks hit by enemy fire could return to battle within 24 hours, patched together with welded armor plates and scavenged parts. This ability to sustain the fight was as decisive as any gun. U.S. Ordnance Field Maintenance Report, 1945. For the Japanese, every destroyed tank was a permanent loss. Their production was fragmented across small workshops, often bombed by U.S. B-29s. By late 1944, Japan could barely produce 120 tanks per month, compared to America's 2,000. The industrial imbalance was now absolute. In the jungles of Luzon and Leyte, it translated into annihilation. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Yet technology alone doesn't win wars, people do. Inside every Sherman were men who had grown from defeat. Many of these tankers had watched friends die in North Africa and had learned the cost of arrogance at Kasserine Pass. They had learned to respect terrain, to coordinate, and to trust their machines. As one veteran later wrote, the tank wasn't just our weapon. It was our home, our shield, and sometimes our coffin. But it always brought us forward. Veteran Memoir, Pacific Armor Association Archives, 1953. By the third day of San Manuel, the Japanese garrison was surrounded. Shells tore through bunkers as Shermans rolled through burning palm trees. One Japanese officer, cornered and desperate, radioed his superiors. American tanks come from all directions. We strike, they vanish. We hide, and they strike again. Their strength is everywhere. Captured communication transcript, Luzon Sector, 1945. When the guns finally fell silent, 12,000 Japanese defenders lay dead or wounded. The 716th Tank Battalion lost just 17 Shermans. The cost ratio stunned analysts. The U.S. command realized something profound. The Pacific, once thought too wild for armor, could now be conquered through coordination, engineering, and logistics. Pacific Armored Analysis Report, 1945. The Sherman's hidden advantage wasn't just steel. It was the industrial symphony that built it, the radios that united it, and the men who trusted it. The jungle had been meant to break machines. Instead, it became the crucible that proved America's mastery of them. But as the war surged toward its final phase, a new question emerged, one that would redefine armored warfare forever. If the Sherman could dominate here, in the mud and monsoon, what could the next generation of tanks do on open plains, against an enemy preparing for its own desperate, final stand? By early 1945, the Pacific had become a graveyard of empires. From the beaches of Leyte to the rice fields of Luzon, the sound of American tank tracks had become a prophecy. Each rumble meant another Japanese position erased, another stronghold crushed beneath steel and fire. But beyond the victories lay something deeper, a shift in the very psychology of war. The Sherman tank had not only altered battlefields, it had altered minds. U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Division, Post-Action Summary, 1945. Japanese soldiers, once the hunters of tanks, had become the hunted. Reports from the 37th Division noted a chilling pattern. Entire Japanese units retreating at the first sound of engines. "The tanks are coming" became a phrase that dissolved morale faster than gunfire. Captured field note, Japanese Second Imperial Army, 1945. What had once been jungle advantage turned into suffocating dread. Machine guns and mortars meant nothing when a 30-ton beast could drive through coconut logs and pillboxes like matchsticks. U.S. Infantry Intelligence Bulletin, March 1945. The Americans, meanwhile, began to see the Sherman not just as a weapon but as a symbol of inevitability. Engineers and mechanics worked sleepless nights in makeshift depots, welding new armor plates, adapting exhausts for tropical heat, and improvising snorkels for river crossings. Each patchwork modification carried the fingerprints of ingenuity. It wasn't just the generals who won the war, it was the technicians, riveters, and factory workers who gave machines their second lives. Ordnance Maintenance Division Report, Luzon, 1945. In one corner of the Philippines, Sergeant James "Red" Hanley's crew repaired their tank after a direct mortar hit. With no replacement parts, they scavenged a destroyed Japanese truck, melting down its panels to reforge a turret plate. The next morning, their tank, painted with a hand-scrawled name, Detroit Thunder, rolled back into combat. "We owed that one to the boys back home," Hanley wrote in his diary. Tank Crew Diary, 716th Battalion Archives, 1945. Behind every victory, the ghosts of attrition loomed. The Shermans were strong, but not invincible. Many burned. Inside those flaming coffins, crews paid the ultimate price for mechanical courage. Yet their deaths weren't in vain. Each destroyed tank became a lesson, each repair an evolution. The U.S. Armored Board analyzed every wreck, refining tactics and upgrading armor. It was Darwinism by design, conducted in real time under fire. U.S. Armored Board Field Evaluation, 1945. Even Japanese officers began to acknowledge the futility of resistance. Post-war interrogations revealed an unsettling truth. By 1945, most Japanese anti-tank doctrines had become psychological rather than tactical. "We told soldiers to fear nothing," one captured colonel confessed. "But when we heard the tanks before seeing them, we already knew. Death was coming." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Psychological Warfare Section, 1946. The Sherman's impact went far beyond combat. Its logistical footprint reshaped warfare. Entire supply chains, ships, cranes, and island depots were redesigned to feed its appetite for fuel, ammo, and spare parts. This global machinery of maintenance became the blueprint for future wars. Every tank in Korea, Vietnam, and even the Gulf carried echoes of the systems perfected in the Pacific. U.S. Quartermaster Logistics Summary, 1946. When the war ended in August 1945, the jungles that once mocked steel now stood silent beneath it. Rows of Sherman tanks rested in overgrown fields, their barrels rusting toward a peaceful sky. Soldiers leaned against them, sharing cigarettes, unaware that they were standing beside the birth of modern mechanized doctrine. U.S. Army Signal Corps Photo Archive, 1945. Post-war analysts called it the triumph of connection. Radios had done what raw firepower could not. They had united men and machines into a single organism. The Sherman wasn't a tank, wrote one strategist. It was a mobile network, a mind of metal that spoke. U.S. Strategic Review, 1947. This revelation would define the Cold War, the idea that communication, coordination, and speed could destroy enemies before they even understood they were under attack. Factories that once built Shermans retooled for peace, but carried forward the lessons of total production. The assembly lines that produced tanks now made cars, trucks, and engines that powered a post-war America into global dominance. The workers who had welded tank plates now welded a new world together. War Production Board Transition Report, 1946. For Japan, the war's end left a legacy of reflection and reconstruction. Engineers who once built the Chiha tank turned to civilian industry, eventually fueling Japan's post-war industrial miracle. The tools of destruction became instruments of progress, but the memories lingered in diaries, in scorched metal, in the silence of the jungles where machines once roared. Japanese Industrial Reconstruction Report, 1948. In the decades that followed, historians would debate the Sherman's legacy. Some criticized its armor. Others have guns. But those who understood warfare's soul knew the truth. The Sherman's real power lay in its adaptability. It was never the best tank. It was the right tank at the right time with the right people behind it. U.S. Armored Warfare Doctrine Study, 1951. And as the Cold War dawned, its descendants, Pattons, Pershings, and Abrams, carried forward that philosophy: mobility, communication, and reliability. In Korea, Shermans again climbed ridges that no tank was supposed to cross. In the Gulf, their lineage rolled through desert storms with digital eyes, guided by the same invisible threads first woven in the jungles of the Pacific. U.S. Army Armor Command Analysis, 1991. The psychological imprint of those jungle battles never faded. Veterans recalled not the glory, but the sound, the deep, rhythmic clatter of tracks moving through rain and mud. It wasn't courage that made us go forward, one tanker said decades later. In the end, the story of the Sherman in the Pacific wasn't about steel overpowering nature. It was about humanity mastering complexity. The jungles didn't defeat the tank. The tank adapted to the jungle. And in doing so, it symbolized a broader truth, that progress, when driven by courage and cooperation, can overcome even the most hostile terrain. The last surviving Shermans still rest in the Philippines, their hulls consumed by vines, their stars fading beneath moss and rain. Yet even in silence, they speak. They whisper of men who defied the impossible, of engineers who turned bolts into destiny, and of an army that learned how to turn chaos into coordination, because in the end, victory didn't belong to the biggest gun or the thickest armor. It belonged to those who could listen, to the hum of engines, the crackle of radios, and the heartbeat of a world learning, at last, to move as one.